There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from doing the same thing over and over and arriving in the same place. You recognize the pattern. You have named it. You have probably explained it to someone. The relationship dynamic, the thought spiral, the career that resets, the version of yourself that shows up despite your best efforts not to let it. You are not confused about what is happening. You understand it completely. And somehow, understanding it completely has not changed it at all. That gap between knowing exactly what the loop is and being unable to leave it is where most advice fails. Because most advice assumes that understanding the problem is the first step towards solving it. Game theory suggests something much more uncomfortable, that understanding and solving are not connected in the way we think they are. This video is not about why you are stuck. You already know why you are stuck. This is about the mechanics of the trap and what game theory, which is the mathematics of strategic interaction, reveals about the only moves that actually change the game. Game theory is the mathematical study of strategic interaction. How the outcome of your choices depends not just on what you decide, but on what everyone else around you decides simultaneously. It was formalized in the mid-20th century by mathematicians working on Cold War nuclear strategy and economic competition. And it has since been applied to evolutionary biology, political science, and increasingly to psychology and neuroscience. The reason it is useful here is precise. Game theory does not care about motivation, character, or self-awareness. It cares about structure. It asks, what is the game being played? What are the payoffs? And what does the logic of the situation dictate, regardless of who the players are or how intelligent they are? And when you apply that lens to the loops that human beings find themselves in, you find something that almost no self-help framework will tell you. The loop is not a symptom of weakness. It is the mathematically predictable output of a specific kind of game structure. And breaking it requires not more effort, not deeper insight, but a different kind of move entirely. One that most people never make because they do not realize it is available. By the end of this video, there will be at least one concept you have never encountered in this context, a piece of game theory called the correlated equilibrium that reframes an entire category of life decisions in a way that I find genuinely illuminating. We will get there. First, the trap itself. In 1873, a newspaper publisher named Christopher Latham Sholes designed the QWERTY keyboard layout for an early mechanical typewriter. The layout was engineered specifically to slow typists down. The mechanical arms of early typewriters would jam if adjacent keys were struck in rapid succession, and spacing out common letter combinations reduced the jamming. The mechanical jamming problem was essentially solved within a decade. The keyboard layout was not. You are likely typing on it right now, a century and a half later, on a device that has no mechanical arms and no jamming problem whatsoever. There are demonstrably more efficient layouts. The Dvorak simplified keyboard reduces finger travel by a significant margin. They have existed for decades. Almost no one uses them. Not because people are irrational, because at every individual level, the switching cost, the time to relearn, the incompatibility with every other keyboard, the friction in shared work environments exceeds the marginal benefit of switching. And since everyone else is staying, you should stay too. The loop holds. Not because it is optimal, because it is stable. This is what game theorists call a Nash equilibrium, a state in a game where no individual player can improve their outcome by changing their strategy alone, assuming everyone else holds steady.
The equilibrium is stable not because it is good, but because unilateral deviation is locally punished. And Nash equilibria do not have to be good outcomes. They simply have to be stable. John Gottman spent 4 decades studying this dynamic in relationships. Working at his laboratory at the University of Washington, where he filmed couples having conversations and tracked physiological responses, facial microexpressions, and communication patterns, he eventually achieved 93.6% accuracy in predicting which couples would divorce within 6 years. The predictor was not the presence of conflict. It was 4 specific communication patterns: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And when you map these patterns onto game theory, what you find is a perfect Nash equilibrium. Partner A criticizes. That is the opening move.
Partner B responds defensively, which is the locally rational response to criticism. Partner A escalates to contempt, which is the locally rational response to defensiveness that fails to address the underlying issue. Partner B stonewalls, which is the locally rational response to contempt when every other option has been exhausted. The sequence is rational at every single step, and it predicts the end of the relationship with greater than 90% accuracy. No individual move in that sequence is insane. The whole is catastrophic. A 2011 paper published in the journal Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics by a researcher named Tassos Patakos made the explicit argument that certain psychiatric conditions, depressive loops, anxiety spirals, obsessive thought patterns, are best understood as internal Nash equilibrium. The mind in this framing is not one player, but several competing processes, each responding rationally to the others. The ruminative thought persists not because the person lacks insight or willpower, but because it is the locally stable response to threat detection, which is itself the locally stable response to uncertainty, which is itself the locally stable response to the absence of resolution. Each loop is rational. The whole is a trap. And the trap is stable for the same reason every Nash equilibrium is stable. No individual move within the game improves the outcome for the player making it. Think about what this means for how you have been approaching the loop in your own life. If the loop is a Nash equilibrium, if it persists because every move within it is locally rational, then the standard prescriptions make no sense. Try harder. Be more disciplined. Understand yourself more deeply. All of these are strategies for playing the existing game better. None of them change the game. And playing the wrong game better is not progress. It is acceleration in the wrong direction.
In 1931, a 25-year-old Austrian mathematician named Kurt Gödel published a proof that stunned the mathematical world. For decades, mathematicians had been pursuing the dream of a complete and consistent formal system, a set of axioms from which all mathematical truths could be derived. Gödel proved that this was impossible. His first incompleteness theorem states that any consistent formal system capable of expressing basic arithmetic must contain statements that are true but unprovable within the system itself. The system always has blind spots that are constitutive of its own structure. You cannot use the system to find the truths that the system's own architecture hides. The philosopher Douglas Hofstadter, in his 1979 book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, extended this insight into cognitive science. Any sufficiently complex self-referential system, including the human mind, will have blind spots that are not accessible from within the system's own frame of reference. The system cannot audit itself completely. The very categories it uses to perceive the world are the same categories it uses to perceive itself. And if those categories are part of the loop is invisible from inside them.
Gregory Bateson was a British anthropologist and systems theorist who in 1956, along with colleagues Jackson, Haley, and Weakland, identified what he called the double bind.
A double bind is a communicative structure in which two mutually exclusive demands are placed on a person simultaneously. They cannot satisfy both, they cannot satisfy neither, and they cannot comment on the contradiction or leave the situation. Every available move within the game makes things worse. The original application was to patterns in family communication that Bateson believed contributed to schizophrenia. The broader application, developed over subsequent decades in systemic psychotherapy, is that double-bind structures exist wherever someone is trapped between demands that the situation itself generates and that cannot be resolved by any move available within the situation. The exit from a double bind, Bateson argued, is not a better move. It is what he called learning 3, a qualitative jump to a higher level of abstraction, a recognition that the game itself, not the strategy within it, is the source of the trap. Here is the implication that most advice will not tell you and that game theory makes precise. Knowing you are in a loop does not change the incentive structure that created the loop. You can understand your attachment patterns, your cognitive distortions, your ruminative triggers, your family of origin dynamics, your neurological architecture of habit. You can hold all of that knowledge with genuine clarity and still produce the same output under pressure because the knowledge lives in a different layer than the incentives that drive behavior. A 2011 analysis published in Clinical Psychology Review on what researchers call the impaired disengagement hypothesis found that depressive rumination persists not because of deficits in insight, but because of a failure to disengage from threatening stimuli. The loop runs not in the layer where understanding operates, but in the layer where attention is automatically allocated. Knowing you are stuck does not disengage the process that keeps you stuck. Imagine a person who has been in therapy for 5 years. They can trace the loop back to a specific childhood dynamic. They can name the cognitive distortion in real time as it is happening. They can watch themselves choosing the familiar path and narrate the mechanism of the choice with clinical precision. And then they choose the familiar path anyway. This is not a failure of intelligence or commitment. This is a person playing a game they understand perfectly, in which the local incentive structure still points toward the same move it always has. Understanding the game does not change the game.
The neuroscience of habit formation offers a further dimension of difficulty. Research published by MIT neuroscientist Anne Graybiel and colleagues established that as behaviors become habitual, the neural processing shifts from the prefrontal cortex, the brain's deliberate, conscious decision-making region, to the basal ganglia, an older and more automatic structure. Once a behavior is encoded in the basal ganglia, the prefrontal cortex largely disengages during its execution. You are no longer making a choice. You are running a program, and the program runs faster, more efficiently, and more automatically with every repetition. Each cycle of the loop does not simply maintain the groove, it deepens it. The neural pathways involved in a well-established habit are never truly erased. They can only be competed with by an alternative pathway that accumulates its own weight through repetition. The habit of depression, the habit of avoidance, the habit of self-sabotage, these are not merely psychological tendencies. They are biological infrastructure, built incrementally, reinforced with every run-through, whether the run-through succeeds or fails. Thomas Schelling, the economist who won the Nobel Prize in 2005, spent much of his career studying how macro-level outcomes emerge from micro-level individual decisions. His most famous model was deceptively simple. He imagined a checkerboard populated with 2 types of residents.
Each resident had a mild preference, requiring that only 1/3 of their immediate neighbors share their type. Not a strong preference, a mild one, a 1/3 threshold. He then allowed residents to move, one at a time, when their preference was not met. The outcome was near total segregation, a board almost entirely composed of homogeneous clusters, produced not by any individual choosing segregation, not by any collective decision, but by the cumulative effect of individually rational micromoves. No one chose the outcome. The equilibrium chose itself.
Social identity research adds a dimension that is rarely discussed. Henri Tajfel and John Turner's work on social identity theory, extended by Michael Hogg's research on the black sheep effect, established that social groups police their own members' conformity more aggressively than they police outsiders. A group member who deviates from group norms, who changes in a visible way, is judged more harshly by in-group members than by people outside the group entirely. The mechanism is straightforward. Your change is a destabilizing signal to the Nash equilibrium of everyone around you. If you change, you implicitly challenge the choices of those who stayed. Your growth is, from inside their equilibrium, a threat. This is why the people who have known you longest are often the greatest source of resistance to your change. Not out of malice, not even consciously, but because you changing requires them to recalibrate their own position. The loop is not just inside you, it is distributed across the social system around you. And that system has its own inertia, its own shelling dynamics, its own equilibrium that resists unilateral deviation.
In 1974, a mathematician and game theorist named Robert Aumann published a paper that introduced a concept called the correlated equilibrium. For this and related work, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005, jointly with Thomas Schelling. The correlated equilibrium is subtle but important. In standard Nash equilibrium analysis, players make decisions independently, based only on their own reasoning about what the other player will do. Aumann showed that in many games, there are outcomes better for all players than any Nash equilibrium, but which cannot be reached through independent reasoning, because reaching them requires coordinating, and there is no way to coordinate without a signal. What is needed is a mediator, a third party that sends signals to the players, telling each of them what to do, in a way that makes it rational for each player to follow the signal, given that they trust the other player to follow it too. The mediator does not need authority or enforcement power. It simply needs to provide a signal that is credible and public enough to allow coordination. The traffic light is Aumann's canonical example. Two drivers approach an intersection from perpendicular directions. In the absence of a signal, they face a coordination problem. If both go, they collide. If both stop, no one moves. If one goes and one stops, the outcome is fine, but they have no way to agree on who does which without communication. The traffic light solves this not by giving either driver additional information about the other, not by changing the payoffs of the game, but simply by providing a salient, trusted signal that allows both drivers to coordinate on a good outcome neither could reach alone. The traffic light is not a player. It has no preferences. It does not understand the game. It is simply a signal, and that is enough.
Picture what this means for every category of help we might seek. A therapist is not an authority telling you what to do. A mentor is not a person with superior information about your life. A book that reframes your situation is not a solution imposed from outside. These are, in Aumann's precise sense, correlated equilibrium devices. They provide a signal, an outside perspective, a different frame, a named coordination point that allows you to coordinate with your own future self on an equilibrium you cannot reach through isolated internal reasoning. You cannot exit the loop from inside the loop, not because you lack intelligence or insight, but because the loop is a Nash equilibrium of your existing cognitive and behavioral system, and that system cannot use its own architecture to identify the exit.
The correlated signal is not a luxury or a sign of weakness. It is a structural requirement. It is the traffic light. John Elster, a philosopher at Columbia University, published a book in 1979 called Ulysses and the Sirens that formalized what Homer had dramatized 3,000 years earlier. Odysseus knew that when his ship passed the island of the Sirens, he would hear their song and be compelled to steer toward the rocks. He also knew, crucially, that his future self, the self in the presence of the song, would not be rational. So his present self made a commitment. He had himself tied to the mast and ordered his crew to ignore any commands he gave while in range of the Sirens. The key insight Elster draws from this is that Odysseus did not overcome the Sirens through willpower in the moment. He changed the payoff structure before entering the zone of temptation. He made deviation from the plan structurally impossible, rather than requiring his future self to resist it. This is the commitment device, a preemptive restructuring of the game itself before the conditions that make the old equilibrium compelling arrive. You are not relying on a better strategy in the moment. You are making the moment incapable of running the old strategy. There is one more mechanism worth naming. In game theory, a finitely repeated game, a game with a known endpoint, behaves very differently from one without a visible end. When there is a last round, the backward induction logic means that the incentive to maintain cooperation behavior unravels from the end forward. The last round has no future threat to enforce cooperation, and since the second to last round knows the last round will defect, it defects too, and so on, recursively, all the way back to the beginning. The implication, applied to personal loops, is that introducing a genuinely real endpoint, committing to an exit, naming a final round, making a deadline credible, changes the equilibrium calculus of every round before it. The decision to make leaving real is not the first step of a gradual transition.
It is a structural change that retroactively alters the logic of the entire preceding game. Clinical psychology has been running the experiment on what actually breaks loops for decades, and the findings are more counterintuitive than most people realize. Behavioral activation therapy, which is precisely what its name implies, a treatment based on doing different things, rather than understanding why you do the things you do, was designated by the American Psychological Association as a well-established treatment for depression based on multiple controlled trials and meta-analyses. It consistently performs as well as or better than insight-based therapies across large samples. The game theory reason is by now familiar. Insight operates in a different layer than incentive structure. Changing what you do changes the payoffs of your daily game directly, without needing to first change your understanding of why you were playing the old game. The doing produces new experiences, which produce new data, which produce new equilibria. The understanding can follow, or not. It is not the mechanism. Environment design is game design. This is the most underutilized insight in all of behavioral science. Schelling showed that outcomes are downstream of structure, that the same people with the same preferences will produce radically different equilibria depending on the structural conditions they operate in. Changing your environment, your physical space, your peer group, your daily routines, the contexts in which you make decisions is not running from the problem. It is changing the game. The same player in a different game structure will reach different equilibria. This is not a metaphor. It is what the math predicts. The reason most people resist this is that it feels like giving up on solving the problem from the inside, but the loop is generated by the structure. Changing the structure is not avoidance. It is the correct move.
The last thing to understand about how loops actually end is perhaps the most important, and it has to do with the mathematics of tipping points. Schelling's work on segregation revealed this in its social form. Systems do not change gradually. They maintain stability, sometimes for very long periods, and then shift suddenly, discontinuously, once a threshold is crossed. Complexity scientists call these phase transitions. The system exists in one stable state, then tips to another, and the transition happens faster than any gradual accumulation would predict. Research published by the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna in 2024 confirmed that in complex adaptive systems, the shift to a new equilibrium often occurs with very little warning. The precursors to the tipping point are frequently invisible until after the transition has occurred. What this means practically is that the experience of being stuck, of working and feeling nothing change, is not evidence that nothing is changing. It may be evidence that you are approaching a tipping point. The work that appears to produce no visible movement is accumulating the conditions for a phase transition. And phase transitions, when they come, are sudden.
Friedrich Nietzsche's most demanding thought experiment appears in his 1882 work, The Gay Science, and is elaborated in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He asks you to imagine that you must live your exact life. Every decision, every consequence, every conversation, every version of yourself that you have brought to every moment, not once, but infinitely. The exact same loop forever. He calls this the eternal recurrence. He did not mean it as a cosmological claim. He meant it as what contemporary decision theorists would call a diagnostic, a way of revealing with maximum force whether you endorse the strategy you are currently running, not whether it has produced good outcomes. Outcomes are partly outside your control. Whether you endorse the strategy, whether the orientation you are bringing to your own life is one you would, if you examined it fully, choose as permanent. In game theory terms, the eternal recurrence is asking, is this your equilibrium, or is it someone else's equilibrium that you are maintaining? The loop you are in may be genuinely yours, the Nash equilibrium of your own deepest values, played out across the repeated game of your life. Or it may be a loop inherited from a family system, a social environment, an early experience that set the payoff structure before you were in a position to evaluate it. The Nietzsche diagnostic does not tell you what to change. It tells you whether you are, by your own lights, in the right game.
If imagining eternal recurrence fills you with horror, if the thought of running this exact loop forever is genuinely unbearable, that is not a psychological symptom. That is information. It is the most important information you have. There is something important to acknowledge here, and I want to say it clearly because this is genuinely difficult material. The loop is not your fault. If the game is structured in a way that makes staying locally rational, then staying is not a moral failure. You are not weak for being in a Nash equilibrium you did not choose. The trap is real. The difficulty is real. The Gödel problem, that you cannot fully see the system from inside the system, is a genuine structural constraint, not an excuse. But the game theory analysis also reveals something that is not absolution. Once you can see the structure, once you can name the game, the loop becomes a choice in a way it was not before. Not an easy choice, not a choice without cost.
The correlated equilibrium you need may require help you have not yet sought, or environments you have not yet entered, or a final round you have not yet committed to naming. But it is a choice. And that distinction between a trap you did not choose and a trap you are now choosing to stay in is the most honest thing game theory has to offer. Game theory did not discover anything that Bateson did not already understand,
or that the Buddhist teachers of samsara did not already know, or that Nietzsche did not already feel in his bones. What it did was give us the language to see that being stuck is not evidence of a character flaw. It is evidence of a specific game structure. That the loop persists not because of insufficient effort or insufficient insight, but because both of those things are strategies within a game that requires a different kind of move entirely. That the exit is almost never a better strategy within the current equilibrium. It is a change in the level of the game. A new signal that allows coordination with a future self the current system cannot reach. A commitment made before the zone of temptation. An endpoint named clearly enough to change the logic of every round that precedes it. A new environment that runs a different game by default. The loop is rational. The trap is real. And both of those things are true at the same time as this. The exit exists. It is just not where you have been looking. If something in this landed, if there is a loop you recognized, consider sharing this with someone who is still trying to play the same game harder. Subscribe if you want to keep thinking at this level. And I will see you in the next one.